start every single discussion with let's try that again because I always forget to hit the broadcast button. So Terry McGlynn is a professor of biology at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and Emilio Bruna is a professor at the University of Florida. And both of these scientists study tropical ecology, different aspects of tropical ecology, but both have also been fairly vocal in the online community about open science. So I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves and give a little bit about what they do and what their positions are, what their experience is with open data sharing. And then, oh, well, we should also introduce you guys too. Let's start out with that. Well, I'll start with me. I'm Christy Ballai. I am the instructor of the Open Science and Reproducible Research course here at MSU, and I'm a postdoc. And I'm primarily a population and community ecologist, and I work in lady beetle aphid systems.
Hi, I'm Logan. I'm a first-year master's student at the Department of Entomology. I study plant pollinator interactions and sustainable ag systems.
I'm Andrew Myers. I'm a first-year PhD student in entomology. I'm in the same lab as Christy, and I study agroecosystem biodiversity conservation, and I'm focusing on monarchs right now, monarch butterflies.
Hi, my name is Baho, and I'm in the same department, the Department of Entomology, and I work for Dr. Bird, who's a nematologist, and my research based on IPM tomato package for Central Asia.
Cool. Okay, Terry, do you want to go first? Because you're unmuted, so it looks like.
Sure. So hi, I'm Terry. So I'm a professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Before that, I was at the University of San Diego. Went to grad school in Colorado. I've been in a few other places. So in terms of the whole open science situation, I would, if you were to look at my stuff in terms of what I do, what I publish, where I publish, what I have posted online, I'm probably like most people in that, like, whatever the opposite of transparent is that opaque? I don't know. But that's not by any intentionality of mine. I'm just doing things the way that I did when I was in grad school, in the mid-late 90s, when I started out as a professor in the early aughts. That's the way people did things, and I haven't radically changed my practices. And so I think most of the things that people want to change sound pretty good, but there's a human element that a lot of the advocacy has tended to miss, and so that's the types of things that I mentioned.
And Emilio, let's see if we can.
Okay.
Oh, perfect.
You guys hear me okay?
Yep, great.
Great. Thanks for the invitation, everybody. So I am actually a faculty member with a joint appointment here at the University of Florida. It's kind of unusual. I have a joint appointment in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, and also in the Center for Latin American Studies. And most of my research, at least on the wildlife side of me, is on kind of plant demography in a tropical world, plant-animal interactions. And that's mainly done in rainforests, but also in savannas as well. And then one of the things I work on in the Center for Latin American Studies is not only capacity building and training of scientists, especially those interested in tropical conservation and development issues from all disciplines, but also science policy, and different ways that we can do science and do it better, and with an emphasis on Latin America. And the other thing I do is that I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Biotropica, of which Terry's one of our subject editors. And so, as an author, I have my perspectives on kind of open science as a movement and the fact that it's important. Big advocate for it, actually, a big believer in the cause, and the idea that we should be doing things like making our code as reproducible as possible and archiving our data. As an editor, I'm also a big proponent of it, but also have to bear in mind the concerns of both authors in general, but in particular the authors that we serve as a journal. Most of the research we do, being a journal that focuses on tropical ecosystems, is done in developing countries or by researchers who are based in developing countries, and that brings with it a whole different set of concerns regarding data archiving and availability, and the concerns they have about what who data belong to and what's going to happen with data once they become publicly available. So that's the things that I have to kind of bear in mind as an author and as an editor. Sometimes I have to deal with kind of conflicting points of view.
And we just had Stacey arrive, so if you want to just introduce yourself and briefly say where you're from and what your background is.
Okay, so my name is Stacey. I'm a PhD student from chemical engineering, and I work on bioethanol production and cellulosic enzyme. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, so she's the odd one out in our group, but she's been really valuable in providing a different perspective because we're just sort of a group of entomologists doing what entomologists do. So you've been great for asking us questions about
and bringing some outsiders.
Yeah, yeah. So this course has been designed to take the students through. There we go. Take the students through actually the whole open science process, just a workflow for open science. So what we did was we started with some data that was actually some bycatch from one of the major data sets that I'm working on as a long-term study, and then we've been working through properly documenting it and doing analysis and then writing, and then we'll be submitting to an open access journal in the end, and so fingers crossed with that. So that's just a little bit of background about what the group is doing. But yeah, so I had the students read your various blog posts on open science and your perspectives on it. And I guess I'll open it up to just seeing if if any of them had any questions and see if we can get some discussion going that way. We're still recovering from daylight savings time, or at least I am. So this is, Emilio brought this to my attention right before class. I had completely missed this, but he was part of a group of scientists that wrote a response to that Mills paper that I had you guys read, where he and his co-authors essentially suggest okay, you got some good points here, but here are some ways that we can be more open and also deal with some of your concerns. So, so let's actually just start out with the discussion. I'll fire out the question. Is long-term data different from other research data? And Emilio and Terry, feel free to interject here.
Different in what sense?
So I'm going to actually, can I actually start by answering that and seeing if people disagree with me?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
The answer is yes. And look, I'm someone who collects. I mean, we've been collecting demographic data that's very detailed and kind of geographically over a broad area, for going on 14 or 15 years now. And it's a lot of work that goes into that. And that's when the rubber meets the road, right? If we publish a paper using these data, does that mean I'm opening them up, making them available to anybody who wants them? I should say that they're already available to anybody who wants them. They have to write me. People have written me and asked for them. Haven't always asked, necessarily to be a co-author on it. But that's really the crux for long-term data, which is put all this effort into collecting it. What next? And so I'd be curious to hear what people have to say. But really, I think that where you are and where you're based as a researcher really affects the way you answer that question. I'm curious to see if people think that's true.
Where you are as a researcher?
Well,
no, I'm sorry. I meant where you are geographically, not where you are. Well, potentially career stage, but especially where you are based geographically. And yeah, I think that actually kind of clouds or affects people's thinking about data archiving and availability in general. You know, I think that that's a lot of that discussion. That's, well, I'll leave it at that. I'll just say, you know, to what extent do you think that's based on the country or the type of university in which you're sitting?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have something to add to that. So I'm also I also work with long-term data. I actually came to this project 4 years ago, but I'm a member of the Long-Term Ecological Research Network in the U.S. So the 26 sites, I think it is, 24 in the U.S. and then 2 in Antarctica, which are long-term funded ecological research sites. And so they're renewed at a 6-year cycle. One of the points of policy for this particular NSF-funded body is that all data is made available largely as soon as it can be processed. And it's been that way since about, I think it's 2003 that they've been making the data publicly available. And so I'm working on a data set that, out of the requirement of the funding body, it's actually been available for quite some time. And there have been people who have worked on it, but very few people have published it in any way other than sort of a meta-analytic sense, other than the researchers that work directly on it here. So Doug Landis, Stuart Gage, Manuel Colunga Garcia, me, and then a few other grad students who have used parts of the data along the way. Now, using the research site that we do, they actually have a policy of archiving all data done at all experimental data produced at the site, as well as the long-term data. Now, in practice, we don't necessarily have the data going up every single day that it's collected. I mean, the database that I'm working on is actually 2 years behind because we're in a bit of a data entry backlog. So that'll be up by the next review because that's when it's that's when it's crunch time. But yes, this is an extremely valuable data set, and it is what attracted me to working here at MSU. I mean, working with Doug Landis, of course, too, who's quite respected in my field, but also this incredible data set, which was an incredible resource that gave insight into a problem that I'd been looking at for my PhD and I didn't have access to. Now, I didn't even realize that these data really existed until I was told about them. So they were publicly available, but not necessarily visible.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big difference, is that, you know, people didn't necessarily know about it. And so that's where I ended up, one of the big things that brought me into the open science community, because I was working with these data that existed and, you know, had to be maintained publicly just because of the rules that we were under. And so it was something that was really exciting to me to see how we could connect with each other based on this whole open network. But I see that there's a lot of supports in the system for this as well. And so our funding is directly contingent on us making the data available. So we have a very strong motivator to keep the data available.
Okay, so if I could add a perspective. So I think long-term data is different, at least in the minds of the people who generate the data. So when a researcher decides to invest, so much money to hire a tech or have a student work on something or so many weeks a year to collect data on something, I think they visualize that as like a bank that they're investing in, like for retirement. It's like, oh, okay, I'm putting this in the bank and I'm making an investment, just like I'm putting money into my 403b account that I'm going to pull on from, when I feel like retiring or when, Trump becomes president, we run out of money or something. And so I think a lot of people are like, well, it's an investment that people made, and you don't want other people necessarily reaping from that investment what you could. Now, I mean, the concept that, oh, well, if data is more useful to people, then why not share it? That's a great idea. The block for some people is that if the notion, the probability, even if it's a low probability, it's a non-zero probability that someone would want to be using those data in a way that you would be planning to. So they'd be basically writing the paper before you would be writing the paper.
Yeah, I was thinking about that being a difference. Like, say you have a 100-year data set, but you have to publish it, you can only withhold it for a year. Then you have, 99% of your data is just out there for everyone else to see, and you only really have access to the 1% that you just collected. You're probably busy collecting the next round, and somebody knows exactly when and exactly what is going to be released. They could get the jump on you, right? Is that kind of what you were saying too, Gary?
Yeah, just along those lines. I mean, I think people have the same feeling about other data sets too, but just with long-term data set, because
you don't have exclusive access.
It's like the long-term data are like, I think some people envision as a balance that you draw the interest from, rather than you do an experiment, you have your data, you publish it, and then it's cashed out. You've done with the data what you want. But most people are collecting long-term data, see it as substantially valuable that you could tap into again and again and again. And so you could look at that as a reason to share it because so many more could tap into it. But the person who collected those data is far more likely to think, well, that's something I want to tap into again and again. If everyone else uses that, then you wouldn't be able to reap the benefits from it.
But it sounds like that's not what happens in practice, right? Is that what you're saying, Christy, about?
I was going to ask that question. Like, it seems like people, at least here, would have an idea of whether that actually happens with the long-term data set that is collected.
I've never seen it happen, and according to meetings with our information management committee, there was one case apparently where someone was misrepresenting the data, and it was caught in review. But other than that, there's been no direct instances of like stealing the data and representing it as, well, we did this study and we found these trends. But data is certainly reused. I mean, we're reusing weather data that was originally collected for,
Yeah.
Lord knows what purpose. But also, like, for instance, I have 3 papers using this exact same data set. Well, the later ones have like 1 or 2 years added onto it. So what I did was I took the whole data series of this lady beetle collection, and I looked at the amount that I predicted the community could eat within a given year. And I looked at it to see if there was any evidence of that changing over time with anything other than, normal fluctuation, and didn't find it. And that was one paper. So that was sort of the core of that one paper. The next paper was looking at the community and seeing if there was an evidence of compositional change in response to invasions. And then the next paper, I focused in on one of the species we were looking at and looked at the individual population patterns, and I put it in the context of agronomic data. And so those 3 papers all have the same data at the core. They're very different papers. And we have lots of other things planned for the data. Looking at, because we have time series, we have potential to look at climate change, we have potential to look at phenology and that sort of thing. And so there's all these ideas floating, and these are things that, if someone was particularly keen and wanted to work with the data, they might be able to beat us to it. But I mean, I kind of look at the security in it, in that the group that I work with, we're the ones who know the most about the biology of lady beetles in southwestern Michigan. And so if someone else was to do an analysis of it, they probably don't have local knowledge of it. And even though we do have good metadata and all the information is available, I don't think that they'd be able to approach it quite the same way we would. That being said, someone might take a meta-analytic approach and say, well, is there evidence of these changes happening in this population of lady beetles in Michigan, or this population of crayfish in British Columbia, or this population of polar bears in Tuktoyaktuk, or all of those things. And so I feel like that sort of thing would be a real benefit if someone did that sort of analysis. But we do have the local knowledge. And that is hard to replace. And that is one of the things that's argued in these balancing of the, like Emilio's rejoinder to this long-term studies paper. And one of the big arguments was in that long-term studies paper that, you know, the people collect the data have more knowledge. And that's true. Yeah. Like, people who are working with it do have more knowledge. But that doesn't mean that the data couldn't be used elsewhere for perfectly valid scientific things too. I mean, my area of expertise is in Great Lakes lady beetle ecology. And so, and I know the other people who work in Great Lakes lady beetle ecology, and I've worked with most of them.
So this might be taking a step back, but it seems to me that long-term data sets will inevitably become open because there's going to be, you know, people cycling through working on the project regardless, whether they're a professor or a postdoc or a grad student, and that the bubble of information and the bubble of people that have that information is ever expanding anyways. So it doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense to keep those, or try to keep those, private.
I'm going to jump in here, if I may, and say that first, I think long-term is in the eye of the beholder, right? So, you know, a 5-year data set can be incredibly rich and valuable just because something is, I mean, you know, that can be really useful, and a lot of those go into drawers because people think this is really valuable, it's 5 years long, and it never gets archived. But I think we're actually maybe asking the wrong question. And the reason is that, or maybe, you know, kind of concerned about the wrong issue. You know, one of the things lots of people worry about is, you know, will I get scooped if my data are publicly available? Or is someone else going to jump in there and do that article that's fourth down on the list of articles I was going to write with this data set and do it before I will? And it's kind of like that weird rumor mill where everybody knows someone's uncle's cousin's sister that it's happened to, but no one actually knows the person directly. There may be, I mean, I am sure, especially if you're working on something related to Drosophila, that someone got scooped somewhere. I've never met the person. I know they're out there. There may be more of them. But I have a bunch of data sets that are on the Dryad, and including one which I put a 1-year embargo on because I said, okay, the clock is ticking. Paper number 2's got to come out within a year. The year is come and gone. I've done the analyses, haven't gotten the manuscript done, and no one's jumped ahead of me in line, although I do know the data set's been downloaded something like 60 times. So I think those concerns are really overblown. Here, the real issue for me with long-term data is that people are making a tremendous investment in it.
Yeah.
And for a lot of long-term data sets, the utility is perhaps in the temporal long-term trends, but a lot of it is because they're being pooled with other long-term data sets into synthetic studies, analytical studies. And as an example, you know, one of the things that you see a lot throughout tropical ecosystems, temperate zone too, of course, is long-term permanent plots of forest dynamics, forest structure. I mean, you know, you basically go out and you measure the DBH of trees every year, every couple of years, every 5 years. Those things are expensive to maintain. It's hard to get the field crew out there. It's a labor of love to do it, and it's not something you can publish on very frequently, right? I mean, it takes, you know, years, if not decades, for you to get enough data. So you go out. These are scattered all over the tropics too, and there in particular, you've got, these are at forestry institutes or people who are at institutions that already have very little funding anyway, right? And they have lots of other pressure on them to do other things, and they're, you know, kind of the societal context is different, so they don't have maybe the technology or tools necessarily to be publishing, you know, highly analytical, statistically advanced science. So what happens? Someone has spent 25 years collecting data on tropical trees in the reserve that's close to the university in Iquitos or whatever. That becomes one data point in a paper on forest biomass change across tropical forests, right?
Right.
And currently, the only currency that people have, if someone wants those data, a friend of, if a guy I did my field work with wants those data, a guy named Simon Lewis, for instance, wants those data to do one of his studies, Simon will call you up and say, look, do you mind if we use your data? And you're welcome to be a co-author on the study. That's currently that's the way in which you control who has access. Did I lose you guys, or are you still there?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Got it. So that's the only way people have access, control of who has access to those data. And more importantly, the return on investment, especially after years, our profession is not caught up to anything other than co-authorship as a metric for, as a reward for productivity, right? So that to me is much, the central issue. It's not about someone scooping you or doing a bad job with analyzing your data. I know bugs are complicated. I work on them too, but they're just bugs, right? I mean, it's not the end of the world to, like, oh, we know about this species, and we work on this species. Bugs are bugs. And trees are even simpler, right? Trees, they grow, xylem, phloem, they get bigger, they die. It's not a huge deal. But if you archive your data after you've spent 20 years collecting it, Simon doesn't have to make you a co-author on his papers anymore, right? I don't have to make you a co-author on my papers anymore. So for some people, that means 20 years of effort, and when the splashy high-profile Nature paper comes out that uses their data, there's nothing in it for them.
Right.
And so that's the rub. I don't think scooping is a problem. Terry will perhaps disagree with me. The real issue for me is, given the context in which people are located and the socioeconomic context in which they're based as a researcher, are you, by asking people to archive their data, taking out from under them the one mechanism they have, perhaps, to either get credit for doing that work for so long and putting in the effort of maintaining it, and forgetting the splashier kind of high-profile publications that come from that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I should say, let me add to that an important caveat, which is I actually wrote an editorial for our journal before I became editor-in-chief, saying I actually thought it would actually be better, we should have mandatory data archiving, both in our journal and broadly, because we tend to think a lot about the costs to researchers, say, in developing countries. But we rarely acknowledge that there are also potentially some really important benefits. The more data are available, some grad student who can't go out and collect data all over the Amazon, or integrate data from North America and South America, if those data were available, a tremendous number of students in developing countries would have access to rich data sets they wouldn't have otherwise, right? You can do your master's thesis from your computer all of a sudden. And so I think there are really huge benefits for the same researchers that also have the potential, that potentially are facing the biggest costs. That's the Gordian knot I haven't figured out yet.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
I have a.
Can I respond for a minute or two with that?
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, I totally disagree with Emilio that the central issue is that the only way to reap any credit for that kind of work right now, the way we do things is co-authorship. Because saying the data will be cited, frankly, for someone who spent decades measuring something, or even like a field season measuring something, to have like one citation to a data set, is not really adequate source of credit. I also think that scooping is not a frequent problem, but I think because it's so I've had a direct conversation with one person who had this happen to her. She was working on bats, and she had basically 2 papers planned from this one study where she was doing a phylogeography, and then she was going to do the phylogeny of the group. And so as soon as she published one that had mandatory data archiving, bam, months later the other paper came out, and she was working on it. She had no idea. But I mean, that's a rare thing. But I think the consequence of that rare event where that's possible, it's kind of like the introduction of wolves into Yellowstone, where it's like, okay, so how many moose actually do get eaten by wolves? Not that many. But then there's this ecology of fear where moose won't hang out along the stream banks, and all of a sudden the physiognomy of the whole landscape has changed because you've introduced this one element. I'm not saying that people reuse other people's data are predators, right? That's not what I'm trying to get at. But that you could have, it's the fear of an individual of something happening to them is far more important, because what is the risk to you personally for your career of, or what are the, what is the risk of not letting it go? It's like pretty much not at all, or the potential benefits are greater because you could be invited into a collaboration or co-authorship. A lot of authors might not be marginalized, but they feel like they are. They feel like someone's going to be taking advantage of them. And there are some, and then there are students and people in developing countries and in lesser prestigious institutions and so on that have, that won't be invited to be involved in big collaborations because of who they are or where they are. And so there's no incentive for them to share at all other than altruism to make science better, and a citation. And so the system's just not built for that credit issue. And so, yeah, I mean, if anything, I would, if I were, sharing data, I'd love for those papers to come out. I want people to write those papers using my data because I don't have the time to write all the papers I want. But do I want them to write it and just cite it? And like, frankly, that wouldn't help my career. And that credit honestly has to matter to me, because otherwise people are thinking I'm not a productive scientist. So
I have a question here. Can we take the long-term data in a similar issue with some ongoing collecting data? So it's like when we talk about long-term, a lot of time it's like it's been over 20 years and we are still working on it, and it will be continued even after I publish my paper. So what I think about this issue is, if I haven't finished collecting my data, and I just think before we publicly archive the data, we should let the data finish its purpose, like whatever the funding it was aimed at, or whatever the researcher or collector was intended for. Like, this purpose should be accomplished first before other researchers want to reuse the data.
Well, that opens it up.
Or you cannot use the same hypothesis or close to that hypothesis.
I feel like hypotheses develop sometimes.
Yeah, so it's like
collection.
yeah, because if it's coming from a funding from NIH, so it will be under a project, and there will be like proposing on that. So I think if the researchers has any plan of any hypothesis or any thought about writing a manuscript, they should finish it first before they got interrupted by it. Because sometimes things can change when you clean the data, the way how you interpret it. Like, yeah, I just think like, yeah, we should just like finish its main purpose first before we go out for share. Like, there's no problem if we just share it on time with collaborators, but making it completely publicly available.
Like real-time availability.
Yeah, real-time availability. Yeah. That's
real-time availability. I think that can often be associated with the opportunity costs. Because that's just not how we necessarily work. Like with our insect collections, we collect during the summer, we process in the fall, and we enter the data during the winter, and so like it would seriously mess with our workflow. But
yeah, because I will be thinking, if I'm in the middle of an experiment, maybe testing the activity of an assay of enzyme, and I got my maybe trial or preliminary test done, and I might have a hypothesis, but if somebody asks me now to share all my data or make it public, I would have a lot of concern.
But what about if it was just at publication? So you have a preliminary publication on that. How would you feel?
I would feel like whatever I have published, I would feel more comfortable for it because it has finished the main purpose from the funding or from the researcher, which is me. That is like its target or timeline is finished. So now it can goes out of the my ivory tower.
Yeah, and most sharing regulations don't say that you have to share in real time. The LTER is kind of a unique exception. It's for the small scale experiments, it's upon publication, but for the long term experiments, we have to be updating in as near to real time as possible.
Yeah, because this come to me when I read Terry's blog today. There was a comment that like just looks very sharp to me. The commenter was saying that once you have published a paper on a journal, you should share your data to whoever asks you for it, not even through the editor. And also, once you open share your data, people can use the data in whatever way they want, even if you don't agree and this might looks rude, but they still have the right to do it.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I can't say I totally agree with it. Like it's a data that being shared publicly, but it's also like a baby or a child of the funding or for the researcher. So even if we want to open up and look for collaborations and for better science, but I still think the collector should get a hold of it in a way or another. I don't know what way is it, but it's just not whatever. It's not that people can use it in whatever way they want. Like there should be limitations or restrictions.
I think that brings up a really interesting point that I think is kind of central to the discussion too, which is whose data are they, right? And so, I mean, so we tend to talk about my data, right? Like I collected my data came from here. These are, I mean, you call them a baby, right? I mean, I love my data, but I'm not changing their diapers anytime soon. But I do love, I'm not, and I mean, I would sleep here in the lab at night with my data curled up on the sofa if my wife and kids would let me. I mean, I totally get where you're coming from. But the question is, whose are they, right? And for, I think we tend to think of them as ours because we collected them. But there's, I think, a very good argument to be made that they are not yours, that they belong to the people who paid for them.
Yeah, right.
And that what you've got is the right to use them first. Before anybody else does, in kind of whatever unique and creative way you want, and you certainly have the right to continue to use them down the road. But after a certain amount of time, and here's the trick, right? Those data don't belong to me; they belong to the taxpayers who funded them, right? The taxpayer. I'm at a public institution, so the taxpayers pay my salary. They pay for the facilities that I use to do my research. The federal government, in most cases, is paid for the collection of my data. So my dad will tell you that they belong to him, right? The question is, when do I have to make them available to my dad or anybody else who'd be interested in working with them? And there will be people who vehemently disagree with the idea that they don't belong to them, but they're wrong. The data aren't theirs. Someone else paid for you to collect them and do something with them. But then when are we done, right? At what point do we have to then say, okay, I'm willing to turn these back over to the taxpayer? That to me is, I don't think anybody disagrees in theory with that notion, but lots of people disagree in how to implement it. At the time of publication, when I feel like it, by calling me, how do we? That's what people struggle with, right?
Yeah.
But
I know Barry has something. I can see he's, his brain on the side of his neck's about to explode.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I agree. Data should belong to who paid for them. Definitely. I mean, that seems to be an obvious thing that should be. And then the issue is the timing or the how.
right.
The problem with the change is even though that seems like an obvious fact, that's not the social contract under which most scientists have been operating under, and that's not the way that the scientific reward system currently supports that, right? So, I mean, so people who are senior scientists now, you know, were trained to hold their data to their vest and then use it as a chip to be able to further their careers to get, you know, to get more papers out, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're, you know, manipulating the fact that the individuals or the agencies paying for the research are not, you know, keeping people honest with being transparent about sharing it. And so when you publish a paper, should the data in that paper be publicly available? I think it totally should be. It makes sense. Why would you publish a paper if the raw data aren't available so that people can see, you know, otherwise it's like not even verifiable. I mean, but that the social contract that at least in ecology we've been operating on, and I think even in like biomedical clinical trials, it's been that way where those data just aren't freely available when you publish a paper. So lately, you know, especially the higher profile journals have started to require that. So the idea is, well, okay, I'll publish my data, but only if I get a paper in ecology, or now I get a paper in biotropica, for example. But if I were publishing a paper, like the last paper I had come out in animal behavior or in ecological entomology, like they didn't require me to publicly archive my data. I wouldn't mind sharing those particular data sets, although it wasn't required of me. But I'd be fine with that. So it's a matter of mindset. And so how do you have a switch to the point where people understand at the moment that they're getting funding and collecting their data, which is exactly what your course is doing. You're developing that practice and mindset initially, right? But you're dealing with an environment where the senior people aren't necessarily doing that. Not quite yet. And so also another thing is actually, for I would say the majority of my data sitting on my hard drive for this machine actually really are mine. Is that, so I've had continuous funding from NSF for a while to train students, but the data weren't necessarily collected under those. But also my employer, oddly enough, with my institution, my job description contains 0 research. As far as my paycheck is 80% teaching, 20% service. You know, and that's in my collective bargaining agreement. We're going on strike about it in a couple weeks, actually. And so, if I do, sometimes I've had time reassigned. Most of my time is reassigned from teaching to do admin work or to do research. And so most of my job actually now is research, but some of it's from the U.S. Department of Education, which doesn't want me, you know, to train teachers, and some of that money is from the Emeritus Faculty Association. Some of it's from my dean, but who knows where he got that from. That might be from federal money, but my university is giving me that money to do the research, even though it's not my job. And so it's not really obvious that if I worked like at a big research institution and I had federal grants, it would be really obvious that both the state and the federal government would say my data need to be available. But if you're a graduate student and you're being funded off of small, tiny, little foundation grants, or you're self-funding your work to do some stuff in the field, you know, and you have a little grant from your graduate school now and then, and most of your stuff is in the field, you're not even using a lot of facilities in the laboratory, is it really true that the federal government or the state has the right and need for you to, I mean, you're already being exploited by being underpaid as it is, and so now your data needs to be available too? So, I mean, I understand that big, large research laboratories that have
the guy who's working at home on, you know, at noon on a Thursday, right? You know, right. But I mean, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, you know, we have a lot of pressure on us, put it as state institutions, and this is just one more. Like, oh, and by the way, give us all your numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So anyway, so it's not as clear cut as people make it to seem, as my point.
Yeah, so I'll follow up on that by saying, you know, and again, I'll phrase it in, you know, kind of Jeopardy style in the form of a question here, so we can get so I can hear some feedback. Those lines are difficult to draw. Is if it's data collected as part of a teaching grant, but you're teaching students to do research or students produce research. I mean, you know, what does that mean? Again, I think really it's a matter of time, and here's what it is. I think it's a disciplinary thing, first of all. I had to publicly archive my first data set in 1994, right? Because it was sequences for molecular biology. You couldn't get a paper published if you were doing reconstructing a phylogenetic tree using genetic sequences without the sequences going into GeneBank. I mean, everybody did it. And there was no embargo, right? As soon as the sequences get blasted to GeneBank, they're publicly available to everybody else. No one in the lab thought a thing of doing that because it was just the norm in the community. Anybody could use your sequences, you could use anybody else's. Ecologists are, coming to this a little later. And here's the trick, right? Everybody thinks, first of all, that their data are dripping with like rainbow-colored fairy dust, and that they're going to mine those data for like 10 science papers as soon as they get that week off that they need to do it, right? And so the problem is that we tend to sit on data because we think we're going to use them later, right? And we're going to use them a lot because they're great. And the fact is, they maybe are, they probably aren't, but we're not going to, right? If you were to tell everybody, look, as a part of your job requirement, accepting a paper, you need to have the data archived and organized, such as soon as you keel over and die, you haven't logged into your Facebook page in a month, Facebook's going to know you're dead. We're immediately going to publish all your data on Dryad because you don't need it anymore. You're dead. And everyone would go, yeah, that sounds about fair. And so we could start at that point, which is the publish on death model, and we can start with the the make all your data freely available the day that the article is published online, and let's try to meet somewhere in the middle, right? And where we meet somewhere in the middle is going to depend a lot, or where you think that middle is going to depend on the situation in which you're sitting, and people tend to forget that, except for people like me and Terry yelling at them, is that not everybody is at an institution where you have I'm counting 4, grad students who think this stuff is important with sweet computers who could probably go and code up the analyses for whatever it is you want to work on as soon as we're done here, right? And not everybody is in a place in which, they're not dedicating 80% of their time to teaching and the other 20% to service, which really means you're actually doing like 120 and 40% of each, right? So that's the issue. It's that it's very easy for people who are at institutions where they have human resources or financial capacity or the kinds of research programs that make it easy to take if you publish 8 papers this year instead of 7, it's not the end of the world. But 2, you're in a position to take advantage of those data sets. That tends to be people who are on the side of let's free the data now, and then you have people who work in so slow places or on slow systems or don't have resources, and they're like, I just need a little more time. So what we did as a journal is, our embargo period is 3 years instead of 1. And after lots of conversations with people, that seemed to be the sweet spot. If you publish the data for the paper after 3 years, people are comfortable with it. If you'd said 1, people freak out. If you say 5, people go, why so long? 3, for some reason, everyone kind of went, okay. And the fact is that as editor-in-chief, if you call me up and say, I'm not ready to, I'm willing to archive my data, but I need 5 years, I'll go, okay. It's just not that big a deal. I think to a lot of people what matters more is, are the data just getting put somewhere so that when you get hit by a bus tomorrow, they don't get lost, right? So where is that sweet spot?
Yeah, and you had this idea, after the embargo policy came out, about how you could have the length of the embargo related to the length of the data set. So if it's a supremely long, 15-year field data set, then the embargo could be, somewhere 15 years or less, rather than just 3, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for you guys. So you've been selected by the university or whatever, collected data, and then you've been paid. You've been paid with high salary, not like.
Who are you talking about here?
Data collectors, and then you are arguing to have the privilege to publish it, but there's another people that can use the data and then publish it as well, and why you have to have the privilege? You've been paid for it first. You worked for it, but
Yeah.
other people did not get that money while you collecting data and then getting money for it, doing the job.
That's usually when we think about authorship. For instance, our undergrad assistants, we tend to have a bunch in the summer, and they aren't necessarily contributing intellectually to the project, but they're instrumental in actually collecting the data. But they're often usually, they would get placed in the acknowledgments of a paper rather than the authorship. Remember how we talked about authorship, choose 3 of 5. It was funding, intellectual contribution, writing, analytics, and editing, or something. It was that, I think. Yeah, I think that was. And so choose 3 of 5, and that makes an author.
Yeah, seems like the collector here is not what's like. It's not problematic. It's more about the researcher or whoever is like undertaking this project.
I mean, I've done a lot of analysis and gotten authorship, and also got paid during that time too. And it's just where the authorship line is, I think.
I think that these are all kind of in the mix, right? I mean, and it still comes back to credit, right? What's the credit you get as a scientist? And trying to get citations, I mean, for data, or the ability to get citations of your data sets, I think is a really big deal. Now, I just had my annual evaluation, and for the second year in a row under my scientific productivity with my department chair, I put all the data sets that were archived, how many times they were cited, all that kind of stuff. And he looked at it. He's a good guy. He cares about stuff. And he goes, I have no idea what to make of this. Do 80? What do 80 downloads of your paper mean in terms of citations? And how then do I turn around and say that you got on a scale of 1 to 5, a 4, a 5, a 3? I mean, what do I do with this? And I said, you're the chair. That's what we pay you for. Figure it out. But that's the issue, right? I mean, this is all not only happening, but it's happening at a time in which credit and how we get credit and what credit means and credit for different things are in flux. My advisor gave me, my co-advisor, one of them, she gave me really good advice when I was graduating. She gave me 2 pieces of very cynical, useful advice. I almost hate to pass them along, but one of them is you're worth as much to your institution as you're worth to another one. And the other one is, which I always thought wasn't true until it was, and then the other one is deans don't read, they only count. Okay? And and that's the problem, right? People who are doing evaluations are always looking for a shortcut, and it's especially trying to encapsulate things in a number. So you can count citations, you can tell someone what that means, but what does it mean if people are for diffuse use of resources you provide to the scientific community? And that's hard, and I think that it's important to emphasize here, too, that we tend to look at co-authorship, but even co-authorship itself is fraught with problems. And so I've sent along I sent along a link to that biotropic editorial. I'll send along this paper, too, only because I think it's a really good example of this issue and what it turns into. So I am not in any way going to knock the people who are co-authors on this paper for being co-authors. That's the world we live in, right? And it's a paper that came out in Nature Communications. It's on carbon cycling in the Amazon, right? And the tree species that are responsible for that. The paper, I think, has 90-something authors. I actually counted it once. And that's because it's one of these papers where they take data from permanent plots across the Amazon, and in return for providing the data, you become an author, right? That's the typical way we do that. That's the lever of control that an individual scientist has for providing the data on their one permanent plot that's going to get a paper into Nature. If you were to scroll down, though, to the very bottom of the paper, okay, on the very last page, right above additional information, it says author contributions. And I'll just give them, I won't do the initials, I'll just do it with numbers. It says here, 1, 2, and 3 conceived of the plot program. 4 wrote the paper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 designed the study. 1, 2, and 3 carried out the data analysis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 coordinated data collection with the help of co-authors. All co-authors collected field data and commented on or approved the manuscript, right? So you've got a paper with 94 authors on it, but basically one person wrote the paper and 5 people did the work of actually sitting down, talking about it, and analyzing. And everybody else on there provided data. So, and they did it because, I mean, they're authors because they provided the data. But authorship and collaboration are not the same thing. And so this bugs me, and it bugs me as a scientist who's from one of these countries and who works closely with people in these countries, and that is that they are co-authors on this Nature paper, but they are not collaborators on this Nature paper. Okay, yeah. And so yeah, they've got the credit for it, but it's still a level of exploitation that we shouldn't have in this. They should not. I mean, we should not be putting people in a position where they're co-authors on a paper because they provided data, but they're not really part of the team. You know, yes, it's their Nature paper because their data were central, but not really because the paper would have probably survived without any 1 or 2 of those data points. And so this is not just about data availability, it's about a socioeconomic context in which researchers are embedded. And that context differs from country to country, and who's driving this conversation is people in places like where we're sitting and not people in, you know, either where we're from or where we work, in the case of me or Terry or maybe some of you.
I have a question. What would have been a better outcome for them?
Given the current context, there is no better outcome.
Okay, because credit is in flux.
Because credit is authorship right now. I'm curious to hear what Terry says, and I see nodding of heads over to the left of the screen, but there is no better outcome right now, because if you had publicly archived your data and it was cited in this paper, you would get a citation. And if your data are cited versus you're the 64th author out of 90 on a Nature paper, it's still better to be the 64th author out of 90 on a Nature paper.
Yeah.
So yeah, you said they weren't being considered collaborators. They were being.
Well, I personally find it difficult to think that all 90 of these people in the author contributions, it actually says that 1 person wrote the paper, basically 5 designed it, did the study, and did the analyses. That means everybody else just handed data over. That's not collaborating. And so, you know, the other thing that Terry and I worked on with Biotropica's data policy is to make sure that we can't force anybody to do it. But just because you can use someone's data because it's archived without ever getting in touch with the author doesn't mean you should do that.
Yeah.
You can be like a normal human being and actually call them up and say, would you like to collaborate? We're interested in using your data. You know, are you interested? If the person could say no. I mean, we've invited people to be co-authors with data sets of theirs they've used, and they've said, nah, that was 10 years ago. Have fun. But you know, that I think we should just be normal and generous with you know, people who collect data. The problem is that, you know, there are going to be people who don't want to in the system, so it's not going to work all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, I have a small question here. So since some journals have mandatory publishing their data available, why they don't have the mandatory rules on that data? So on the underscore says you have to, before to use this data, you have to contact with the collector.
Because you can't require anything. Publicly available with no strings attached.
No condition.
No conditions. And so you can encourage. It's a matter of cultural change rather than requirement, right? You know, economists will tell you that you can modify human behavior with 2 different strategies, with incentives or with taxes, right? So that's why, you know, that's when you do your tax return in the United States, you're getting one of those 2 things. And so we can either, you know, as a society, we can do exactly the same thing. We can tax people for not being generous. In other words, we can spread the word about how horrible someone is as a scientist because they're not willing to work with people. Or we can provide some kind of incentive to people who are willing to collaborate with people. But there has to be a cultural shift.
Yeah.
Terry?
Yeah, so I was I had connection problems, so I missed the majority of that. But I Yeah, I'm with you entirely on that, and I would say so parallel to the situation to some extent for people in developing nations are for people who are at universities like mine or in like small liberal arts colleges. Like if you have someone who is not at a research institution, then really it seems like almost no one wants to collaborate you. I've been doing this for 20 years, and finally, now that people recognize that I have a lot of expertise, actually publish papers and have quality students, then maybe some people are inviting me to collaborations. But if I were transplanted to a research institution, then all of a sudden people are collaborating the crap out of me, and it's because of where I am. And it's like, why would you work with someone who's at that kind of university? I mean, internationally, people get my university confused with the UC, so I don't have that problem with big international collaborations. But if there's a U.S. person involved, then I have that huge set of issues. Which, I mean, it's a thing I live with, is a big part of my job, and my blog's about that. But the same thing is this is where undergraduates are being trained in the United States, and especially if we're trying to diversify who's in graduate school, who eventually becomes professors. You know, the source of this ethnic diversity is actually coming from these underfunded public schools for the most part.
Yeah.
Unless we're taking care to have genuine collaborations with people with whom we involve, we just don't helicopter in and say grab students, or we just don't use them for their data and then not work with them, then we're exacerbating and making the problem worse rather than fixing it. Yeah. And so the thing is, so it seems to me that a lot of these pushes to make science more open are pushing people on the margins even further to the margins.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about.
Wait. I'm gonna jump in just a second and say, wait, because and also I gotta go in just a bit because I know you guys probably have to too. But
yeah, me too.
The thing I'm gonna say, I think that's possible. Where that's a potential outcome, but I think there are enough voices making sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Hopefully. And the other thing is that this is a lot of the big changes are actually being driven by developing countries where because of the fact that because they governments like the government of Brazil, for instance, are recognizing that a lot of those data were collected within their territory and they want them, and that it's kind of intellectual property that's being exported, and they can require it, and I do think that the possibility is there for a cultural change if people are willing to invest in ways to figure out how we can credit and reward people for their efforts. I will say that ultimately, although I'm critical, it's criticism with love. I'm very much a proponent of this, and there are some very personal scientific reasons why I think it's a good idea. Archiving, having to do my first data archiving for a paper that was accepted, showed me what a incredibly bad job I was doing about organizing data, metadata, the column headings, record keeping, all that kind of stuff. It took me probably longer to reorganize the data for archiving than it did to write the manuscript. I swore to myself I would never be in that position again. And since then, knowing that I'm going to archive my data whenever I submit a paper has made it, has caused me to be much more organized at the time I'm collecting and organizing data entry and the data management side. The same goes for code. And the fruit of that is, so you guys read the blog post I wrote on the opportunity cost of doing that. The next paper that's using that data set, last year at the ESA meetings and tropical biology meetings, I gave a talk with that. It took me 15 minutes from the moment I opened up the script in R to the moment that I had the results for the next paper, right? So there is a follow-up post that will be written, and it's all because the data were organized, the scripts were clean, available, had been vetted by others, and the record keeping that I'd had to do, because of the kind of open science push, just made it so much easier for me to get the next paper off the door. If I had started doing that when I was at grad school, I can't imagine how many more papers I would have had, say, my first few years as a faculty member.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time I spent was figuring out what did I do with this MATLAB code? Where are all the what are all these Excel tables for? So yeah. I really do think there's a huge benefit as an individual researcher to doing that.
Yeah. And that's one of the big pushes behind this course. And to rejoin to the diversity and open science thing, we do have a diversity issue in North American open science. It's primarily represented by people at large research institutions, and I completely acknowledge that. But when we go to the broader open science community, this is the part that really hooked me. When I went to MozFest last fall, it was a group of people that looked like the group of people you saw on the London Underground. And it was so much unlike a scientific meeting that I've been to, that it was just something really inspiring, because it just gave me this feeling that, wow, okay, we are actually, with this group, reaching people who want to participate in science. We're reaching the larger group of people who want to participate in science. And it doesn't necessarily look like what Western academia, the dominant form it takes at least, is. And so that's why I think that we have a lot of potential to foster diversity. That being said, yes, in Western academia, we have sort of a group of very vocal people, and they tend to be white men, frankly. And so there's an opportunity to bring in more people, but we have to be cautious about how we build the system out.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, I'll leave you with this, because I do have a kid to go pick up at daycare, which is that I think what it comes down to is, unfortunately, the people who are in the position, who've been in a position to take advantage of it for the benefits for the longest period of time, are now the people who are saying everybody else should do something different, right?
Yeah.
So I say that, but I also give my students the choice, right? I don't require anything, because I recognize that they have their own careers to make. And I am also just more of someone who I'm not sure I believe so much in revolutions. I think change tends to be a little more gradual than maybe people are comfortable with. So I have a feeling that most of the opposition to things like archiving data and everything will just die soon. I think that there's definitely a generational difference, and I think that's not overly satisfying to some people, but it is to me, because I think that if we stop seeing the world as black and white and recognize that it's a lot more gray, I don't care what the embargo period is, make me an offer. Sure, I'm happy to collaborate with you, it'd be great. No, they're not my data, they're data, and any paper that comes out of it is good. And I think if people just chilled out and also try to be better human beings, a lot of these issues would disappear. Unfortunately, our profession tends to attract people who by nature are socially maladjusted, so I'm not sure how, what that means, but I'm convinced that there's a generational shift, and the people that you all basically are this will one day just be no big deal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny. Our visiting scientist from Sweden, we asked him what the general attitudes towards open science were, and so it's funny because this laptop is in about the same spot he was sitting in our lab meeting yesterday, and he said, "Oh, yeah, our government requires us to make our papers open access, and if it's funded by the government, we have to archive our data, usually in an institutional repository. There's some people who don't like it, but they're old and they'll be moving on soon enough." And so that was his take on it too. It's just, this is just something that's changed a little bit more in his corner of science, but it's something that's gradually changing, and yeah, human decency and a few different regulations and things will change. And on that note, I'd be very happy to collaborate with either of you on anything in the future. So, and
go for it. Data are there. Take them, use them, have fun with them. Call me.
No authorship for you then.
Yeah. I just said we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Terry, see you
I'll
later.
send you
See ya.
the invitation. Okay, bye-bye.